October 5, 1933. A railway platform in Berlin, cold under a gray autumn sky. 10 children stand in a loose cluster near the ticket barriers, each clutching a small case. To anyone glancing over, it looks like nothing more than a school outing, perhaps a trip to the countryside. A handful of parents linger nearby, careful not to embrace their children for too long, careful not to weep, careful not to do anything that might draw the eye of the men in brown shirts patrolling the concourse. Inside those cases, folded beneath spare shirts and photographs of home, is enough clothing to last 2 years. Nobody says so aloud, but everybody on that platform understands they may never see Germany again. 300 kilometers away, in the village of Herrlingen near Ulm, a 54-year-old headmistress named Anna Essinger has spent 6 months preparing for this single morning. She has recruited trusted teachers to lead 3 separate parties of children along 3 different routes out of the country, timed so that no single train carries enough of them to attract suspicion. She has taught the children rudimentary English in secret. She has raised money in Britain, found a house to receive them, and rehearsed again and again in her mind every way the plan might unravel. If the Gestapo has pieced together what she intends, armed guards could be waiting at the border. If one child says the wrong thing to the wrong stranger, the entire operation collapses. And yet, Anna Essinger is not evacuating a handful of pupils. She is smuggling an entire school out from under the Nazi regime, one child at a time, in plain sight. This is the story of a German school teacher who looked at Adolf Hitler's Germany in 1933 and understood faster and more clearly than almost anyone around her exactly what it would become. It is the story of how she turned a small progressive boarding school into a lifeline that would eventually reach hundreds of children, first pulling them out of a country descending into tyranny, and later, after 1945, gathering up the shattered survivors of the Holocaust who had nowhere left to call home. Hers is not a story of armies or weapons. It is the story of what one woman, armed with nothing but conviction, patience, and an old manor house in the English countryside, managed to build in defiance of the 20th century's greatest catastrophe. And it matters because it asks a question that never goes out of date. When the world turns cruel, what is a single person actually capable of doing about it? To understand why Anna Essinger's actions were so remarkable, it helps to understand exactly what she was working against. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within 2 months, the Enabling Act had handed him near total power, sweeping away the checks that might otherwise have restrained him. Jewish teachers were dismissed from state schools. Jewish businesses were boycotted. Books by Jewish and dissident authors, including Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud, were thrown onto bonfires in town squares, Ulm's own square among them, barely a mile from Anna's school. Political opponents, trade unionists, and outspoken clergy were already disappearing into the new concentration camps springing up across the country, held without trial, for the crime of disagreeing. For a Jewish family raising children in Germany in 1933, the maths were becoming brutal. Emigration was legally possible, but practically fraught. Currency controls meant families could take almost nothing of their wealth with them. Visas abroad were scarce, and many countries, including Britain and the United States, operated strict quotas that left desperate applicants waiting for years they did not have. Sending a child alone to a foreign country, to strangers, in a language they barely spoke, was an almost unbearable decision for any parent to make. And yet, the alternative, keeping a child inside a country whose government had begun stripping Jews of citizenship, employment, and legal protection, was rapidly becoming unthinkable. Anna Essinger had already built something rare in German education. A school called Landschulheim Herrlingen, founded in 1926, that rejected the rigid discipline and rote learning of the traditional German classroom in favor of curiosity, self-reliance, and mutual respect between staff and pupils. Former students remembered it as a place where they were taught to think for themselves rather than simply obey. That philosophy alone made Anna a target once the Nazis consolidated power, because a regime built on obedience has little use for schools that teach children to question. When local officials ordered her to fly a swastika over her school, she staged a quiet act of defiance, sending every pupil away on a camping trip so that not a single child would be present to watch the flag go up. It was a small gesture, but it told her everything she needed to know about what remained possible in Germany and what did not. The scale of the problem then was this. An entire generation of German Jewish children stood on the edge of a system built to erase them, while the adults meant to protect them faced closing borders, dwindling money, and a regime that punished exactly the kind of organized collective action that might have saved large numbers of them at once. Individual rescue was difficult enough. Rescuing an entire school, keeping it intact as a community rather than scattering its children into an uncertain patchwork of foster placements, seemed close to impossible. That was the challenge Anna Essinger set herself. There was also a quieter, less visible problem, one that had nothing to do with borders or paperwork. Even families who succeeded in getting a child out of Germany faced an agonizing second question. Out to where, and into whose care? Britain's Kinder Transport Scheme, launched after the violence of Kristallnacht in November 1938, would eventually bring around 10,000 unaccompanied children to the country, but it operated, of necessity, as an emergency triage system. Children arrived at Liverpool Street Station in London with a label pinned to their coat and were matched, often within hours, to whichever host family had volunteered a spare room. Some found genuine warmth. Others found households that treated them as unpaid domestic help or simply had no understanding of what the child had already been through. There was rarely time, in the crush of an emergency evacuation, to think beyond the immediate question of shelter. Anna Essinger had recognized this problem years before Kristallnacht made it urgent for the wider world. A child who loses their country, their language, and their family in the space of a single journey does not simply need a bed and a meal. They need continuity, familiar teachers, a familiar rhythm to the day, other children who understand without needing an explanation. Building that kind of continuity across an international border on a shoestring budget in the years immediately following an economic depression, with a hostile government at one end and a cautious, immigration-wary Home Office at the other, was the genuinely impossible-sounding task Anna set out to solve. Her solution was, in its own quiet way, an extraordinary piece of logistics. Rather than simply advising families to flee individually, Anna resolved to relocate her whole school, staff, curriculum, and pupils together to a new site abroad, so that the children would not just escape Germany, but land somewhere that already felt like home. Throughout the spring and summer of 1933, she traveled across Europe scouting locations in Switzerland, Sweden, and Denmark, before finding a warmer reception in Britain, where Quaker and Jewish community networks agreed to help her raise funds in secret. She eventually secured Bunce Court, a large manor house in the Kent countryside, as the new premises for her school. The technical challenge lay in moving dozens of children across an increasingly suspicious border without triggering alarm. Anna divided the operation into 4 separate departures rather than one large, conspicuous exodus. In late September, she traveled ahead with an advance party of 12 teachers and senior pupils, establishing a plausible cover story of a short sabbatical abroad. Then, on October 5th, 3 further groups departed simultaneously along 3 distinct rail corridors. One team collecting children at stations along the Rhine from Basel, a second sweeping from Munich through Herrlingen to Stuttgart and Mannheim, a third crossing northern Germany entirely. Each teacher had been briefed for months. Each child had been coached to behave as though this were an ordinary school trip, packed lightly enough to avoid suspicion, yet carrying, folded into their luggage, 2 years' worth of clothing. The manufacturing of this deception, if you can call it that, happened in kitchens and sitting rooms across southern Germany that summer, in small secret gatherings where Anna met parents to explain the plan and win their trust. Nearly every Jewish family at her school, along with a number of non-Jewish families who shared her alarm, agreed to send their children. Staff spent the summer term quietly teaching English alongside the usual curriculum, preparing pupils linguistically for a country most of them had never seen. The border crossing itself was the moment every contingency plan existed to survive. Teachers traveling with the children later described armed guards on the platforms, papers checked and rechecked, the agonizing wait as a train idled at the frontier before finally, mercifully, pulling away. Only once the children reached Luxembourg, and later the docks at Ostend in Belgium, did the tension in each carriage begin to lift. From Ostend, they crossed the channel to Dover, where Anna herself, whom the children called Tante, meaning aunt, stood waiting on the quayside. 3 red buses carried 65 children through the Kent countryside to Bunce Court, and the sound of their laughter as the buses pulled up told the staff everything they needed to know. The children understood finally that they were safe. That first group of 65 was, in the end, only the beginning. In the years that followed, hundreds more children arrived at Bunce Court, refugees now not only from Germany, but from Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, as families used whatever means remained to them to send their children to safety. In the months before war broke out in 1939, a further large group arrived via the Kindertransport, the wider British rescue effort that ultimately brought around 10,000 unaccompanied children out of Nazi-controlled Europe. Bunce Court became one node in that much larger network, though its particular strength was continuity. Children arriving there did not simply find shelter, they found teachers who already understood their language, their fears, and, increasingly, the fate closing in on the families they had left behind. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It was after the war, though, that Bunce Court's role changed most profoundly. As Allied forces liberated ghettos, labor camps, and concentration camps across Europe from 1945 onward, a new wave of children arrived at Anna's school, this time not fleeing danger but emerging from the wreckage of it. Many had survived years in hiding or in camps and now had nowhere else to go. Their parents were dead, their homes gone, their entire pre-war world erased. Understanding of psychological trauma in children was still primitive by modern standards, yet Anna and her staff built something close to a therapeutic community by instinct. Every child contributed to communal life, tending vegetables, caring for animals, cooking and cleaning alongside their studies, so that responsibility and belonging replaced the isolation so many of them carried. One girl who had survived the war, hidden in a single room for 3 years later, recalled her first spring at Bunce Court, watching snow melt into crocuses, and thinking simply that this was what home felt like. A boy who arrived from a displaced persons camp in Poland, undernourished and withdrawn, was gently drawn out through caring for the school's animals, later crediting the community with teaching him not just literacy, but how to trust people again. Documentation from this period is patchier than historians would like. Bunce Court was a small private institution, not a government agency, and it kept the kind of records a boarding school keeps rather than the kind a refugee organization keeps. Exact totals of how many orphaned survivors passed through its gates between 1945 and the school's closure in 1948 are not precisely known, and some of what has survived comes from later memoirs, letters, and oral testimony rather than contemporary paperwork. What is well documented is the pattern. Children arriving from displaced persons camps across the British and American occupation zones of Germany and Austria, many routed through refugee organizations working to place young Holocaust survivors with institutions willing to take them, and Bunce Court's staff, several of whom were themselves German Jewish refugees from the original 1933 exodus, meeting them not as strangers but as people who understood precisely what had been lost. The psychological impact on those children is the part of this story best captured in their own words rather than in statistics. Former pupils described a slow, deliberate rebuilding of trust, achieved through nothing more dramatic than shared mealtimes, regular routines, and adults who did not flinch from what the children had witnessed. For young people who had spent years learning that adults could not be relied upon to protect them, that steadiness was, in its own way, as significant an intervention as any formal therapy available at the time. Set beside the wider landscape of Kindertransport rescue efforts, Anna Essinger's achievement stands out for its completeness. Sir Nicholas Winton, working from London, is rightly remembered for organizing the transport of roughly 669 children out of Czechoslovakia in 1939, a logistical feat built on paperwork, guarantees, and host families found individually for each child. Truus Weismuller, a Dutch rescuer, personally organized dozens of transports that brought close to 2,000 children to temporary safety in the Netherlands, often placing them with whichever family or orphanage had space. Both were acts of tremendous courage, and both, by necessity, scattered the children they saved across unfamiliar households with wildly varying degrees of care. Anna Essinger's model was different. She did not simply move children from danger to safety. She moved an intact community, teachers and curriculum and all, so that a child leaving Herlingen in October 1933 could still be taught by a familiar face at Bundscourt years later. Where German institutions of the period were designed to strip away individuality and enforce obedience, Anna's school was built on precisely the opposite principle, and that inversion, education as sanctuary rather than instrument of control, was in many ways her most radical innovation. The material impact of Bundscourt is, by its nature, difficult to state in hard figures. Precise numbers of children saved directly through Anna's efforts were never centrally recorded, and some of what is known comes from later correspondence and memoirs rather than contemporary documentation. What can be said with confidence is that by the school's closure in 1948, more than 900 former pupils were in contact with Anna, scattered across the world, many of them Holocaust survivors who had rebuilt entire lives after arriving at Bundscourt with nothing. The psychological impact, meanwhile, is easier to trace through the testimony those pupils left behind. Descriptions of a community that treated trauma not as something to be suppressed, but as something to be gently outlived day by day through work, companionship, and small, deliberate acts of normal life. Among those pupils, Anna Rose went on to become a city auditor in Berkeley, California. Sam Oliner became an academic who founded an institute dedicated to studying altruism and tolerance, a subject he had, in the most literal sense, lived through. Neither owed their survival to Anna alone, but both attributed the shape of their later lives, their capacity to trust and to build again, to the years they spent under her care. Bundscourt itself closed its doors in 1948 when Anna's declining health made it impossible to continue, and she spent her final years, nearly blind, in a small hut on the school grounds, visited and read to by former students who traveled from around the world to see her. She died in 1960. The house at Bundscourt still stands today in the Kent countryside, a private residence now, its lawns and outbuildings quiet where hundreds of children once learned, for the first time in years, what safety actually felt like. It would be easy to tell this story as a single dramatic escape, a headmistress outwitting the Gestapo on a railway platform in 1933, and leave it there. But the true measure of what Anna Essinger built lies in what came after the escape succeeded, not an ending, but the beginning of 15 years spent absorbing the human cost of a catastrophe that was only just beginning to unfold when she first defied Berlin. She did not stop the Holocaust. She could not undo what had already been done to the children who arrived at her door in 1945, hollowed out by camps and hiding places and years without a home. What she offered instead was something almost as difficult to build. A place where the worst thing that had ever happened to a child was not the only thing that would define them. Picture that platform in Berlin again, October 1933. The children with their overpacked cases and their carefully controlled faces, the parents holding back tears they could not afford to show. None of them could have known, standing there, that this quiet, unremarkable-looking group would become the first of hundreds, that a manor house in Kent would become a refuge not once but twice over, first for children fleeing tyranny and later for children who had survived it. Anna Essinger asked for no recognition and received little in her own lifetime. She simply did the work. 6 months of secret planning, 15 years of running a school that never turned a frightened child away, and a lifetime spent proving that education could be an act of rescue as surely as any train, any ship, any border crossed in the dark. A headmistress moved a school. In doing so, she moved hundreds of children from the edge of history's cruelest chapter into lives they were allowed, finally, to call their own.